This is the account of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittim, and the Dodanim. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to its language, according to their families, by their nations. So, we're starting Genesis chapter 10, and I decided to dramatize and add some music behind the reading of the genealogy this time, because let's be honest, most people get bored reading genealogies, but hopefully that at least kept you a little more engaged. But if you noticed, it had kind of a European feel or vibe to it, and that's because we're going to break down Noah's 3 sons, and we just started with the first. So, first off, we're going to go into the very first verse and then lead into the first son, which we just read, which was Japheth. Now, I want to start off with verse 1. And we had that similar terminology to what we had in all of the other genealogies so far. And that's that this is the account and then ... So basically, this is the storyline. This is the family tree. So we're getting Noah's sons' family line because this is the account of Noah's sons. So we're moving on from Noah. We're basically now taking him and we're extending the family tree and the story forward with all the people who are being listed. So this is where the genealogy family tree begins, and you may remember if you've listened to previous episodes how important a family line was, especially to the Hebrews, and they wanted to know where they came from, but also the story and the people of faith and the specific line which they came through, because as you can see, there's special people that God is working with along the way, and you keep seeing these branches off. You had originally Adam and Eve, but then they branched off to Abel and Cain, but Abel never got a family tree because he was murdered. But then you had Cain's line, and then you had his brother's Seth's line, and Seth had a line that was calling after God, but it didn't say anything about Cain with that. And then you get a little bit further, and is there going to now, with Noah's family line, be a specific one that we should look out for? If you remember, we ended off on talking about Ham and his son Canaan and how that line was cursed. So when we get to Ham, we should talk a little bit about that. And if you remember Japheth, what we can expect is basically that his territories are expanded. And so when we look at some of the nations, be thinking about that this is what Noah basically blesses or prophesies to his son Japheth and Shem, and the opposite of a blessing is curse, which ends up going to Ham. And it doesn't mean that every descendant of Ham for all time is cursed. It doesn't mean that every Canaanite absolutely was cursed and beyond the shadow of hope. However, a majority, you'll actually begin to see things unravel with that actually being close to the case. And so that's why paying attention to genealogies is so important. And a good episode to go back to if you haven't ever learned about genealogies and just began the podcast is episode 32 entitled Genealogies. And then also you could go to episode 36 as well, which is Noah's family. So those two right there encompass a lot of family story and genealogy, family line, and it talks about that concept and introduces it, I believe, in a really easy to understand way and a really relatable sort of fashion. And that's what I'm going to try and do today. It's going to be very academic heavy at the same time. So this episode is hopefully for, as I say in the beginning, anyone who wants to learn more about what the Bible is trying to say. And now that we got through the first verse, we have the three sons, as we mentioned, and there's Shem, Ham, and Japheth, which is the birth order of the children. So the only last thing to note in verse 1 is just that it specifies that all of these sons were ones that were born after the flood. And sometimes it's important to pay attention to these phrases, which kind of just feel like null phrases in a sentence. We kind of just throw some of the words in our sentences in there just because it ends up fitting the style of what we're trying to say. And sometimes that's the case, even in scripture. However, it does specify that all of the sons here are ones that seemingly were born after the flood. Did they have sons and daughters that came before? Possibly, probably, who knows? And is it possible that, like we've talked about, with potential exaggerated language, that some of these sons that came weren't actually already born either on the ark? Because I'm sure they had a lot of downtime and time to get busy, if you know what I mean. But with that said, we're going to begin going through Japheth's. So why is Japheth first if Shem is the firstborn? I don't have a good answer for that. So if anyone has any sort of ideas or conclusions about the matter, you can contact me. So beginning with Japheth, or as he's known in Hebrew, Yaphet, which we won't call him just because the podcast is in English. We have it list his 7 sons. And are those all 7? And what about the daughters? So we've already talked about this in the genealogy episodes, but many times, and especially in this genealogy, you're actually not encountering just the children that were born to them, but you are encountering the family leaders of tribes and civilizations that begin entire people groups. And because there were not a lot of people back at that time, when people began to form families, they'd obviously unite as clans and as families, and they would begin to end up forming these, again, civilizations, tribes together, obviously to protect themselves, to build cities, and to be more productive and have protection. And also, who can you trust better than family? And who can you trust more than people you're creating a partnership and union with? And that's what a nation is a bunch of people who live in an area together, basically with one flag, even though they come from different families. At the same time, they kind of live like they're participating under the rules of the same family. And you have that with gangs. When gangs form, or mafias, they'll end up uniting under a group name or a family name, and they will essentially protect each other and stick together. And that is what's happening in the genealogies. It's under the surface, so that's why I'm trying to get this concept out there to begin. Back in biblical times, when this was written, it was kind of common knowledge that family trees were important because that's where you came from. If you are, for example, let's take one that is going to come in a little bit. We had one of Gomer's sons named Ashkenaz, and the interesting thing about that is you might be aware of the Ashkenazi Jews. And even though they were not all just direct descendants of this guy, it is a branch off where the Jews who were basically exiled towards the later centuries of the BC basically started merging and integrating and migrating to some northern places, especially after persecution in Roman times. Then they spread, and the Ashkenaz people who originally started at one place, which we'll talk about later, migrated a little further northwest, and that's where a lot of the Ashkenazi Jews that we knew of and still have around today come from. And so this is the powerful part of genealogies, and this is why they're so special, like especially if a Jewish person can trace back all the way to the second generation after the flood. Of course, they can't trace every dot in between, but the fact that you know of one of your ancient ancestors who set up your tribe or your people group or ethnicity, that's pretty powerful. And that's pretty uniting as well. And we all unite, as I was mentioning, under people groups. And people groups is another word for ethnicity. Even within a country, you could have many ethnicities. Even like I was saying with Jews, you have specific subgroups or even smaller ethnicity groups of Jews. All right, so with getting back to Japheth's first son that's mentioned at least, and like I said, this is probably excluding other sons and obviously daughters, because family trees are always in Hebrew tradition stemming from the patriarch and essentially the tribe leader. So one last thing to note, which we'll talk about, and I already have, but it'll get even more into detail as we go. A lot of times, for example, go down to Javan's son, Katim. Katim is actually a plural for Keet, and the eem at the end is essentially what makes Keet plural. So it's basically the Keats, if you wanted to put it that way. And we're going to get more into these kinds of things in the future, but it's not just talking about a guy named Katim. It's actually talking about, as I've been mentioning, an entire people group and family that stems from this patriarch, either named Keet or something along those lines, or that's what his name evolved into, or at least what he was called in Hebrew. Because that's another thing we have to take into consideration. You know, why don't some of these names line up with names we have from history and other cultures? A lot of times, just as you would expect, every language has their own pronunciation or nickname or version of a name that they end up giving to a person. And sometimes names were meaning based, so they would change, or again, a nickname. For example, like one we'll end up getting into in chapter 11 is pretty big, and we can make a parallel to a culture we do know when we get to chapter 11. This is why genealogies are huge, because you can take big name people in scripture and sometimes actually find the culture in which the Hebrews ended up encountering that person and their culture by a different name, then getting to see what the Hebrews called them. So even though I know that was a little bit confusing, we're going to rein it back in, and we'll start off with Gomer. Not much is known about Gomer from most of the commentaries that I've read. It says in a study note in the Net Bible that he was the ancestor of the Sumerians, and I'm not very familiar with the group, but it is pretty well known that they were a group of people that ended up settling above the Black Sea, and they had a pretty wide territory from what it seems. So that's Gomer. He's essentially in that, I guess you could say, somewhat Eastern Europe area, north and to the west a little bit of the Black Sea. So then the next son that is mentioned, or we could even say the next group descended, is Magog. And this is why I said pay attention to the names, because if you look it up in a study Bible, you'll see that Magog is not actually one word. It's not just a name. It's actually two words merged in one, and it literally means land of Gog. So there's a land called Gog, and most likely it was named after a descendant named Gog. At least that was his Hebrew name. And Gog is only mentioned a few times, but a lot of people have noticed that it's in prophecies in Ezekiel and Revelation. And that's huge, especially considering that Revelation does have future implications. And so a lot of people are trying to pay attention because that's why these things are important. What is Gog or Magog? Where is it? What is it today? Why is it important? What was it back then, and how has it evolved through history? And what does the Bible say in other places about it? So let's read one in Ezekiel, and we're not going to spend the entire time trying to interpret these prophecies, but I'll just read them and leave you to think about it, that this is Gog or Magog here. So it says, Ezekiel 38:2, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, prophesy against him. Whoa! What? This is pretty far into the Old Testament, and here we have the names crop up. As I was telling you, if you didn't believe me, that Magog means land of Gog. Literally here it says, set your face against Gog. So Gog is obviously the ruler and the person seemingly in charge of the land of Magog. And there's a chief prince there, or a ruler, and his name is Meshech. And we also have Tubal. Wait, those were actually two of the others. Those were two of Magog's brothers, if you want to say. And whether or not Gog had two brothers that were still these places, or whether basically the family lands of these three brothers' lands of the future related and linked back to what we're reading about here in Genesis 10. So that's crazy. So that was Ezekiel 38:2. And now we're going to go to Ezekiel 39:6. And in that one, it says that I will send fire on Magog, or the land of Gog, and on those who live in the safety of the coastlands, and they will know that I'm the Lord. So there's obviously a coast, so it must be somewhere on the sea. And it makes sense since the Black Sea is a pretty large sea. And although it was not as big as the Mediterranean, it was definitely on the top 2 to 3 biggest bodies of waters that they knew of in that region, excluding the ocean when you go down south more to the Arabian Peninsula and to Africa. So there's one other passage, and it goes to show how Genesis links and points to Revelation. And we've talked about this before. In Revelation 20, verse 8, it says, I will go out to deceive the nations in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, they are like the sand on the seashore. So honestly, we're not going to spend time diving into what that means, but you've seen another verse at the very end of the Bible now that we're reading the beginning. This is why, again, it's important to learn genealogies. So if I haven't made it clear that genealogies are important and they can actually be super exciting if you stop treating them like boring lists, it actually can help you to actually understand what's going on in the Bible. So I think the biggest thing would be, when coming to the genealogies, expect that it's actually important instead of assuming what you feel when you read it. Oh, it feels kind of boring to read a list of people's names. That's not at all what the Hebrews who were writing this were trying to get across. So now we come to the next person, and we'll start moving a pinch quicker, and we'll stop on some for things like this again. We have Madai, and in short, most people are agreeing in consensus that Madai basically became the land and the people of the Medes and of Media. And you probably know of that region. It's basically that other half of the Persian Empire, but they also were broke off on their own. So they had been a nation way before, and they were bordering that area of Persia. If they were there the entire time is unknown, but it seems as if that's where they settled in most of ancient history. Then you have Javan, which is not actually pronounced that way again. It's actually Ion. And that also coincides with the Greek name, which also does not have J's in it. And the J's are substituted for I's in both Hebrew and in Greek. So here, this is where we get the Ionian people, and the Ionian people essentially are what settled in to become the Greeks and that Asia Minor, European, Greek sort of heritage people. They were people of the coast who settled in that region. And so that's pretty cool. Now we know where the Greeks came from this guy called Aeon or Yavon or Javan, as we're calling him. And then we have Tubal. And if you remember, Tubal is a pretty common name back then because we had Tubal Cain as one of the children back in the genealogy, stemming from Cain's family tree. And it's no wonder someone wanted to name their son both this popular name that was both before and after the flood, and on top of that, after Cain. But here, it's just Tubal. And who was Tubal? Most people don't have much information on him either. but in the Net Bible, it suggests that they were a militaristic tribe, also north of the Black Sea. So they were probably some kind of Slavic, Baltic, Eastern European, modern day, at least, area tribe. And it seems as if they were pretty big on war. A lot of nations back then were, but some more than others, obviously. Some had the means to. Then we have Meshech, which, if you remember, we had Tubal and Meshech, which appear later on in Ezekiel. So pay attention to them. They're actually important. So Tubal is what we just talked about, a northern tribe above the Black Sea. Meshech basically became also a nationality in the north, like some others. And so it seems as if these two brothers are neighbors, and you can see that actually reflecting in Ezekiel. So then we get to the last mentioned son of Japheth, and we have Tyrus, and he actually appears outside in this book of Jubilees, and it's said that basically he was the ancestor of the Sea peoples, which is a pretty infamous name of a group that people knew existed back then. Some people suggest that they were the people who ended up settling in North America after several generations. Some people say they were the Philistines. Some say that they were settling in basically the Levant, which was between the Egypt and Holy Land area, and then they ended up migrating later on. And yeah, there's just so many legends with the name of this group. And there's also other legends that he became an idol and was worshipped as the god Thor. So now we're starting to get into how ancestors, especially when they began a family and were looked up to as idols. You know, we have shows nowadays with the word idol in it, and people look up to these figures. It was in a whole different category back then. For example, the pharaohs were basically viewed as the container of the gods manifesting on earth. And so that's why people basically treated some high up leaders of people groups as gods, because they thought that they were actually the manifestors and the leaders and the people who heard from and led the people to be able to know God, and I should say the gods, because the Hebrews also had a somewhat similar view, but it differs in a few major ways. And whereas other nations believed that certain people were actually God containers in a way, essentially, you could say similar to incarnations in even Hinduism. You have a lot of gods or forces in nature, and that ends up manifesting in different individuals. So essentially, those people in ancient history were considered gods, because they were the manifestation of gods. And so there is actually a somewhat similar story that ends up getting played out in the Hebrew tradition and merging into what ends up becoming Christianity. However, as I mentioned, there's some huge key differences, and that's the fact that there is this one God who made everything. He's the God of all of these other powers and gods. And yes, people can contain and have God or his spirit with them. And yes, there are spirits on this earth, but there's only one true God that should be acknowledged. Everything else is idolatry. And so, if it's true that Tyrus was Thor, and you can even see that T in his name and the R, a lot of times, like I was saying, when languages end up transferring the stories, they end up converting the names into their own language as best suitable with their alphabet and phonetics. And so, whether or not that's true, another thing about Tyrus, which is probably the most agreed upon, is that they were the Thracians that were in the Turkey sort of area. And so this was possibly the area that they began in, and maybe part of the group splintered off and became what is known by some of these other myths, as we were talking about. But then, as I was mentioning, this group also seems to be documented in Egypt as well. So one last thing that I found on this group is that it's also suggested that they were red hair, blue eyes people with tattoos. And so when you conglomerate all these sorts of things, and especially when you tie in some of that stuff like the red hair and blue eyes to maybe what ends up being some people who end up settling in the Germanic areas, hence how the legend of Thor could have started. It's no wonder how things end up evolving over time, and people take the stories, they misinterpret strong leaders as gods, especially in ancient history, and you get all of these different variations of what's really the same thing, but we don't have a cohesive language and documentation of what happened to this people group and how they splintered off in different ways and where they went and what sort of languages adapted terms for them in different parts of the world. And so here, the Bible specifies at least the origin of these people as Tyrus. Moving on to Gomer's descendants, or his kids, or the groups at least that came through him, were, as we had mentioned, Ashkenaz, Rephath, and Togarmah. And so we'll talk about those few for a second. We had already mentioned Ashkenaz and the connection that has with later on more Western migrated European people, but there was definitely a long history, and it was more Eastern European before that point. Some people suggest that the Ashkenaz were the Phrygians, so that's a general term, and most scholars seem pretty convinced that this was the Scythians, which was an Indo-European group that essentially settled in that either Armenia or maybe even Iranian sort of area of the world, but later on migrated a little more to the west as time had gone on and dissolved into other things and names. So then Gomer's next son that's mentioned is Rephoth or Repoth. And it's interesting because he's actually mentioned by a different name, or you could say just pronunciation, in First Chronicles. And so I wanted to talk about that for a second because we actually have almost exactly the copy and paste version of this genealogy, but in a book that comes later. Essentially, Chronicles is the chronicles of what happened from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, through the Kings, and it's basically a summed up, compiled version of what had happened so far. Some people believe it was written quite a bit later on, after most of the other books had been written. So it was basically like a re-summarized account. And so they had genealogies in there, and essentially Genesis chapter 10 is taken pretty much name for name. But here we have a slight variation. We have Repoth, but in First Chronicles it's Depoth. And if you know anything about language, you know that R's and D's in a lot of languages, because of the rolling R or da, you can kind of hear with that alone that many times that R, L, D can get mixed up. And so it's no surprise that someone probably misheard his name at some point and began writing it down differently. So Repoth became Depoth. And so this is how difficult connections and word evolution happens in the Bible. And this is why it is helpful to have study Bibles so you can catch things like this. You might look at Genesis and then First Chronicles and be like, oh, the list is the same. Oh, but here they didn't mention Repoth and they have this guy named Depoth instead. Again, for that, at least, even though we could go for a while talking about other things related to manuscript copying and the passing on of the names and traditions and the word and all of these things. But here it seems pretty simple. So who was Repoth? Not much is known about him. Essentially, that he most likely settled in Anatolia, in like the Turkey region, and that's all I was able to find about him. The last son of Gomer was Togarma, and this is actually a name that's also mentioned in Ezekiel, and it's found in both chapter 27, verse 14, and chapter 38, verse 6. We can talk about that for a minute, because if you notice in these passages, it actually mentions a lot of the names that we have been talking about. For example, let's go to it right now. So we got, if you go to chapter 27, starting in, let's say, verse 12, you see Tarshish, you see Greece, which could be also Javan, as we had mentioned before. And then we see Tubal and Meshach again. But then we see men of Beth Togarmah. And that Togarmah there is this second son of Gomer. And with him, why does it say Beth Togarmah? It's because the word Beth or Bet means house in Hebrew. So basically it's house of Togarmah. And here, house means family of as well. So there's just so many tie-ins to the concept I'm sharing with you guys. Family, households, family clans, people groups, ethnicities. It's so important to the human story, not even just the Jewish story, but the Bible highlights how it has run through the fabric of all of our cultures. Just think about anyone's name. You have, for example, a lot of Hebrew names that are Bar something or Ben something. Bar and Ben means son of, or like we're talking about here, you have Bet or Beth something. In this case, it's Beth Togarmah. And we have so many occurrences of this, even if you look in different languages, which I've mentioned in the genealogy episodes. If you have a similar thing as the Ben and the Bar in Hebrew, you can have in Italian, like my mother's family, Di Natale. With that, it means of the Natales. And obviously, if you were to put a word in front of, it would be son of Natale. So you also have a lot of other things like Van, ... also has the meaning of son of. You have Mick, Donald, or Mick, ... and Mick actually means son of. So everywhere you look, all of our roots are actually baked in the biblical way of being human. We come from families, we come from people groups. Basically, we all have an ethnicity, and this is what it's talking about. And they had different people groups at the time, because obviously times have changed. There's been groups that have been exterminated, that have died out. And there's been ones that have been assimilated and conquered and taken away their identity, that have changed names and reformed governments. And now today, the landscape of the world and the people groups has been so mashed that sometimes we're like, why should I even spend time learning what it was like back then? And these are some of the reasons why, because it connects all throughout the Bible. And if you want to understand the Bible, and if you want to understand even how you got where you are today, and maybe if you do some DNA testing in the future, there may possibly be ways to connect yourself all the way back to the beginning, and maybe, who knows, even to one of these first sons of Noah. And honestly, that would be amazing. I wonder what mix I am, but as of right now, at this point in history, basically everyone's lost their heritage going back more than however many generations. So, with that said, we have another passage that we'll look at in Ezekiel. I wanted to pull up another one that's somewhat related as well. And in Ezekiel 38:6, it says, also Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops, the many nations with you. So obviously that's a fragmented section, just broken off and totally out of context. But here you can see Gomer. Gomer is the father of the house of Togarmah. And here it goes even a step further to show this, and it also gives us a little info that Togarmah is somewhere up in the farther north. So how far north was it? Not 100%, but it was definitely above Israel without a doubt. It also seems, looking at some maps, which if you look at a map of all of these ancestors, you can find them. And honestly, I'm just going to leave a link of an image search so you can look up a bunch of different maps and kind of get an idea of where each of these peoples were settled. So for the people of Togarmah, it seems as if they were most likely below the Black Sea, like right above the Israelites, above the area of Syria and Aram and all that. So they would have probably been directly above that. And then we move on to Javan or Eon, however you want to pronounce this guy, and his descendants, the Ionian people, the later on Hellenes/Greeks. You have this Southern European people where you have the bottom coastline Europeans coming from the Ionian people. And with that, you get a totally different culture than either of these two sons and where they came from with the Japheth family line. And so with that, let's talk about his sons. First, we have Elisha, and I couldn't find much on him other than basically they were a people by the coastline, and on top of that, I read somewhere that they were popular for the colors red and purple, which I don't know if that had to do with maybe their nation's national colors, or whether that had to do more so with dyes and inks and things related to trade that they were popular for. And So Cyprus is obviously a coastal island off of Greece. You have the sun Tarshish, which is, most people suggest one of two things. Either the most popular being Portugal, which Tarshish is actually mentioned in Jonah as essentially the farthest port possible that could be traveled to on boat. Jonah, who was a prophet in Israel, was trying to get as far away as he could, probably on the Mediterranean Sea, away from not only Israel, but he was supposed to go to Nineveh, which was in Assyria, which Syria is essentially modern day Iraq. So he had to go east quite a bit from Israel. Instead, he actually decides to try and get as far away as possible. So, what's the furthest point to them known at that time? It was possibly Portugal. And so he travels to the coast, at least he tries to get to Tarshish, but it doesn't work. And he ends up getting spit back out on land and has to end up going to Nineveh anyways. But getting back to Tarshish here, most people suggest Portugal or Spain being the area of Tarshish. And some people even go as far to say as potentially the UK Isles. So it's possible that some of his people ended up settling there and then even expanding even further to the UK Isles and islands out there. And it's interesting because, Tarshish being essentially a port city where Jonah was trying to sail to, because obviously boats end up sailing from ports. Portugal literally means port country. So I just found that interesting. And then we get to the third son mentioned, which is Kitim. And as I mentioned for this one, the eem at the end actually is not part of his name. It is essentially saying the people of Keet. So these people, also many suggest that they were associated with Cyprus. So which one was it? Were there maybe these two groups settling in Cyprus? Possibly. I've also seen that in other commentaries, it says that the Romans referred to this group as the people of the Rhodes, which is also an island in that Aegean area of the sea out there, somewhat near Cyprus. So there's these groups which are essentially forming the southern parts of Europe and of especially the coastal areas. Then the last son is Dodonim, which the eem at the end is essentially the people of Dodon or Dodon. And also some people suggest that these people also settled in the area of Rhodes. So with that, we have finally Japheth's family tree covered. But to be honest, if we look at it, his is not even the longest. We have only a little bit into just Japheth's line. And although I might not be super exciting to listen to, you can see how there's amazing content that fills up even in a short part of a genealogy, an hour's worth of exploration and material. And you could dive a lot deeper just into each one of these sons or families or groups that ends up branching off, because you have to remember that each one of these sons and their sons are basically another branch off of the main branch, which is Noah. So Noah and his wife are the ones who end up branching off all of these others. And as we go, especially once we get to the end of chapter 10 and this part of the genealogy, notice how it doesn't necessarily end when we will get there. So just keep that in mind, because essentially, if you take a look, it's talking about Joktam's children, and it's basically not only talking about them, but remember, these are the account or the story of the people of these family lines. So when it stops, it, just like earlier when we were going through Cain's family line, we stopped abruptly at Cain's and we started having some stories about Cain. And then we came back to the genealogy and we finished it off and we found out, oh, that leads to Noah. So the question is when we stop in chapter 11 from the genealogy in chapter 10, who is it going to talk about? But then when it picks back up, who's it leading to? Who's this next major character? Because I will tell you ahead of time to look out for that many times these are how genealogies work, because they start the branches, but then you're supposed to remember that they stop, and then you have to remember to pick up where it left off. And sometimes it even gives you the recap and then helps you to move back forward again. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sabteka. The sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod. He began to be a valiant warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The primary regions of his kingdom were Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and the great city Calah. Mitzrayim was the father of the Ludites, Anamites, Lehabites, Naphtuhites, Pathrusites, Keslahites, from which the Philistines came from, and Caphratites. Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, Heth, the Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hemathites. Eventually, the families of the Canaanites were scattered, and the border of Canaan was extended from Sidon all the way to Gerar as far as Gaza, and all the way from Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, and by their nations. So we're on to the second section, which is Ham's genealogy and the account of his family line and his descendants. And if you remember, this is the son that in the last story ended up doing something not good to his father. And we also talked about Canaan a lot in that episode. And here, what do you know? We see a genealogy with a son he had named Canaan. Who would have ever guessed? So we're going to be breaking this down, but also we had this little intermission in between, and you could see that we took a minute to focus on this guy named Nimrod, and most of you probably have heard the name before, and if you haven't, you've heard of how this name ended up giving rise to the way that we use it nowadays, which is to basically call someone an imbecile. So we'll cover a generous amount about Nimrod because he's such a core ancient history figure. He essentially is the prototype if you look back on things for everything that is wrong with humanity in the world, but sometimes you can't always see that and you have to read in between the lines. However, we'll go over and explain that, and it will get explained as the story continues because basically the Bible, as was being read way back in the day, they were assuming that you knew a lot of the genealogies and the groups of people, the ethnicities and the countries that existed. And they also went on the assumption that you knew both some of the old names and also some of the names in other languages, and sometimes what the names were in surrounding countries and previous time frames, as I mentioned. And that's one of the most difficult things about putting together genealogies, because the Hebrews were infamous for this, but so were some other nations. And so many times putting together all of these records from all around the world, it can be hard to corroborate history. And with that, let's jump into talking about what we can at least take away from the genealogy, because there's still gold. And by knowing at least the Hebrew names of what they're referring to these different groups of people, these different sons, these different lands or countries as, will help you to understand the story later, even if it doesn't give you a full-on history lesson of the ancient world. We still can glean quite a bit, as we've already gotten so far, just from Japheth. And so we start off with Ham. His first son, or at least the first one it mentions, is Cush. And This is mainly thought of as the people of Nubia and the early Ethiopians. And so it was that region of Africa back in that time. And then we have the next son, which is Mizraim, which is better pronounced Mitzrayim. And this is actually the modern day name in Egypt for Egypt. So you can guess who Mizraim is. It's literally Egypt. Egypt goes even by the same name today because Arabic comes from the same Semitic sort of roots as a lot of the ancient languages. It's related to Hebrew, and Hebrew is related to all of these other ancient Akkadian Semitic languages. So that's actually a name that still is around as is. One other quick note is that some also say that it was some of the other northwestern sort of African tribes that Mitzrayim settled into and became, but we also know that Egypt had quite a bit of control in land back in ancient history, but essentially it can be understood as Egypt when we talk about Mitzrayim. And then we have Put. Most people believe that he was the founder and ancestor of the Libyan tribes to the west of Egypt. And so you can see the trend that all the countries we've talked about so far are from the Africa region. And so this is a lot of the original people of that area. And with that said, that's actually why I went with the African music in the background just a minute ago. And as we get into Shem, I'll give away that for the most part, he's the, you could say, Middle Eastern or Asian predominant family line. And obviously, there's been so much mixes of even these three sons, children all over the world to get the very diverse ethno-diversity that we have today. And with that said, we get to the last of Ham's sons, which kind of breaks the mold. But technically, even some of these sons, for example, like Cush's son, even though most likely a lot of those sons that he had became more, you could say, darker skin, African, modern day seeming people. We also have the people that ended up settling, like we are about to get to with Nimrod, those who lived in the, I guess, further east part of the Middle East with things like Babylon and Assyria and all of this. So we get to Canaan as well, though, as I was mentioning, and essentially this is the Western Middle Eastern people, such as those found in what's considered the Promised Land, and even throughout essentially that Dead Sea sort of area surrounding that area, all the way from Saudi Arabia up to the area of Syria. And so it fits in that sort of range for the people of Canaan. And we're going to get into some of their children, talk more about them, but that's just a general overlay of where the original first 4 sons went to and where most of their descendants populated, settled, and came from. So we get into verse 6 where it says Ham's first son, Cush, and some people say that it is actually a mispronunciation of Kish. His first son that it talks about is Seba, and from what I've found, either that was South Arabia or northern Egypt. So there's kind of that middle ground sort of area. And also, at some point in ancient history, those two parts of land were probably actually connected. And maybe even after the flood, they were still closer together than one would think. And so, if they traveled across sea, it's possible that they could have lived in both regions. And so then we have Havilah, however you want to pronounce it. If you want to get Hebrew, Havilah. And if your memory is good, we've actually already talked about not just this son, but we've mentioned this name before. I'll pause for a second so you can try and remember. So if you go back to Genesis 2:11, we have the land of Havilah, which is one of the main areas that it was talking about even before the flood. So this land still existed, and it's possible, as I was talking about before, and this kind of corroborates how even if before the flood they didn't call that land by that name, it's clear that the later known names of regions impacted what they call the places of the past. And hopefully that makes sense. But for example, right now, if I were to say there was World War II in Russia, someone would say, oh, well, at that time, you should be referring to it as the Soviet Union. I would say, it is what it is. That's what we call it now. And so why can't the Hebrews do the same thing, even if they were to know one of the previous names of a place? They're probably going to call it colloquially the closest thing to what they know it as, or what's most common in reference. And sometimes they would take foreign words and names and they would refer to things that way as well and borrow terms into their language. But this is the difficult and confusing thing. So Havilah, he possibly was a son of Cush, but it's also possible that this could have been the people who settled in that old land of, or what became the area of Havilah. So we're obviously getting into some interesting stuff and concepts. But moving on, there's not really much of anything I could find on the son Sabta. And just reading here in the Net Bible, it says that his descendants were near the northern shore of the Persian Gulf in ancient Hadramaut. So there you go. Moving on to Ramah. His people were the ones who settled in southwest Arabia. And on top of that, in Ezekiel, it actually mentions two of these peoples. It says the merchants of Sheba and Ramah traded with you for your merchandise. They exchanged the finest of all kinds of spices, precious stones, and gold. Well, hey, what do you know? These kinds of precious jewels were found in the area of Havilah, and so it's clear that that region of, what's considered to be a gold mine with oil today, we have lots of precious resources in that Saudi Arabia area, even modern day. With that said, it's a little confusing because we talked about how Cush could have been the founding ancestor for the Ethiopian, or we could say Eastern African people. However, we didn't get any sons that specifically correlated, so some people suggest that it was just the Arabians. However, that doesn't mean that there weren't more sons, or the main branch of his did actually settle in that area, but it doesn't specify. One thing that is true about genealogies is they're trying to not only give you a family tree, but also a world map. So hopefully when you look at genealogies as family trees, you're also building a map at the same time, because especially in genealogies like this, we're not just talking about, oh, these were the only sons that these people had. There was obviously more descendants involved in all sorts of branching off and crazy family relations, especially considering that there probably wasn't a huge pool of people for people to mate with at the time. So, considering all things, that is Cush and what we have on him, at least at the beginning portion, and is trying to build that map of Cush is essentially, you could sum it down into the people of Arabia, and potentially, if we were to go based off of what some other people say, that sort of Eastern Ethiopian sort of area. And especially if the continents separated over the matter of time and some went one way, some went the other, who knows? Also, then we get to the last of the sons, at least that it mentions, and that one is Subteca, and most people say that this is another group that settled east of the Persian Gulf. So we still have basically Arabia sort of area. So then we get something interesting by getting just two of Ramah's sons, and that's Sheba and Dedan. And the interesting thing is, we were actually just reading about Sheba a little bit earlier. It's really interesting and cool to learn about some of the origins. And Sheba, you'll read later on, even interacted with Israel when it became a more full-fledged nation. One of the queens ends up visiting and giving gifts of actually gold. And here we can see that some of these sons of Cush are basically, that Saudi Arabia, Southern Arabia area. And we could also glean that they were trading peoples, that they were really big on trade. And we'll actually see this going forward, that they were big on their merchant business in their nation. And I should say people groups and nations that made up these areas. So the other son, Dedan, that's mentioned is speculated to be upper or northern Arabia. And that's most of what I could find on that. So here we can see, basically all it does say about Cush's heritage is people who ended up settling in this Arabia sort of area. Then we get around to verse 8. And, you think you have all the sons, but then it says Cush was the father of Nimrod. And I was like, he wasn't mentioned in the previous verses. Why does he get his own section as if he's extra important from the rest of Cush's sons? Well, here we can see that there's a whole little dedicated section to him, and we see the man, the myth, the legend, Nimrod, in all of his glory. For a few verses, it talks about how he's a valiant or great warrior on the earth. But then it even goes further and it talks about him being a mighty hunter before the Lord. And what in the world is it talking about? And, who is this guy Nimrod? Because as I was mentioning at the beginning of Ham's genealogy, he's one of those really important figures to understand because he is like a prototype for the people that stem from him. And so we kind of also, we'll get to it in a minute a little more, but Ham's line being cursed, as we talked about last week, we can see some correlation because when it talks about Nimrod in this chapter, it kind of basically hints towards the next and the future chapters, because it says here that he was actually most likely the founder, it seems, of Babel, which, as I mentioned, is just in chapter 11. So even though, as we'll read it in the next chapter, it strangely does not mention the name Nimrod, we basically are set up knowing that he's the main guy. Like, he was a mighty hunter, a leader, someone who really had built up these cities. So most people assert that he was the king and founder of essentially Mesopotamia, or as in scripture, it's called Shinar. And this is essentially that Babylonia, Mesopotamia sort of area, that lowlands and eastern area of the Middle East. And with that said, there's so many things we just hit on. He was also the founder and the leader, it seems, of some other nations, as it mentions, like Erech, Akkad, and Kelna, which are essentially all of the old Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Sumerian sort of kingdoms of ancient history. The Erech also pronounced differently as Uruk, which was a really famous city of Assyria in ancient history. Also having Akkad, which connects to the Akkadian people, and having Kalna, which connects to that Chaldean sort of ancient heritage that ends up settling all in this sort of Mesopotamia, Babylonia sort of area. Then, as it mentions in the next verse in 11, which we'll get around to after we talk about Nimrod a bit more, but some people are uncertain about whether it continues to talk about him or whether it's talking about someone else. Most people assert that there's the individual of Ashur, which is where Assyria or Ashur, for its name back then in that place, were named after. However, we'll continue to talk about that in a minute. So, Nimrod, when you look up his name, you'll find all sorts of things. But let's start off by saying that Nimrod was 99% chance not the guy's given name. It was his Hebrew nickname, which essentially means rebel. And, what? I thought we were talking about how he was such a great and mighty warrior before God. Like, isn't that a good thing? Well, when it talks about it here, and when you read the narrative, and when you end up studying and taking some of the Hebrew idioms or ways of talking about things, to be a mighty hunter could possibly be referring to things as disgusting as essentially being a human slayer and even possibly a cannibal. And if nothing else, he was a strong, militant, and belligerent sort of leader. And it's most likely that he did do a lot of conquesting of people. And just the expression, from everything that I've read, at least from Jewish literature, it doesn't paint this phrase in a positive light. To be a great warrior or a mighty warrior champion is or can be a good thing, so that definitely could be painted in a good light. It definitely is emphasizing how he was a strong and dominant force, and how whatever kind of stuff he was doing, he was really powerful and effective at that time. But also, since we don't know too much about him and we can't even connect him necessarily to one person, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's hard to gather information on him. But that second phrase for sure is negative. Again, in the Net Bible, it says that essentially to be a mighty hunter means that he probably was hunting people. There's also some references which I won't read, but you can look up 1 Samuel 24:12, Jeremiah 16:16, and Lamentations 3:15, which use the term hunting in this kind of way. And even with David, he was being hunted by Saul. And so, if nothing else, the fact that he was hunting either individuals or worse, hunting entire people groups. And in other words, he was the first exterminator and the first conquistador that possibly ever existed. And we start to see very early on, there's this really great battle or war that is happening, and we will get around to it in a few chapters, but I call it the First World War that ever existed, because this was the first record of warring nations, and it seems like there is some kind of crazy leader and really powerful guy behind these things. And so I also want to talk about how Nimrod's story obviously is not the first generation, not even the second generation, but technically the third generation. And so there's obviously some buffer time and gap. And who knows if there possibly is other stuff that wasn't mentioned or they lost some history. So this was the best that they could compile, because it's possible that this story is actually overlapping some of the story that comes in the following chapters in 12 and 13. And so that's kind of what I'm hinting at right now. We're essentially giving the genealogy and the map up front so you can hit the ground running with knowing what's going on with the world, because essentially this is the Jews' history book. So of course we need this information to be able to go back and understand how things became the way they did, especially because they were closer tied to the history back then than we are nowadays. And so, we go back to Nimrod. Some other things that I'll throw out there is that Nimrod is viewed almost in every tradition as a giant. So it's possible that either these sons of gods or giants or whatever ended up already infiltrating back within the first 3 generations after Noah and his sons. Or it's possible that, again, they survived in some kind of way through Ham's line. And this story is just so messy. Like, how in the world did things happen? Or, was there some kind of messed up genes that happened and could possibly the fact of them having sex in ways that God didn't condone, like, end up screwing with the gene pool? And is that kind of like we were talking about with Canaan, who we'll get to possibly being a child of maybe Ham and his mother, which was Noah's wife. The crazy thought that, some of these could be essentially creating some of the messed up family pools that, who knows, could lead to genetic mutations like the giants. This is possibly also how we get those future stories, because as being a mighty man. I'm sure he had a lot of mighty women that he took on, and I'm pretty sure that he populated his family tree quite a bit, especially back in those times. They took a lot of wives, or they had kids with a lot more people than people nowadays ever dream. And so, even though that's not talked about, just throwing out some speculations and connecting some dots. But, Nimrod in verses 8, 9, 10 is a really big deal. So let's talk a little bit about verse 10. And it says the primary regions of his kingdom. So, like I was saying, it doesn't say that he was the king, but if it was his kingdom, basically, he was the leader, king of what it says is Babel, which we're going to talk about that story and what ends up happening there. But then it also talks about Eric or Rook. And this is one of the infamous cities of Sumer or Babylonia. And so it kind of overlaps with Babel, but Babel is specifically the core main city of Babylon. And so there's a lot of overlap in history with these kingdoms, especially Sumeria and Babylon. And then we have also Akkad, which, as I was mentioning, the Akkadians were pretty widespread, and the entire language group that the people spoke, including affecting what became or was Hebrew, that all was essentially Akkadian language. And then you have Kelna, as we were mentioning a little bit ago as well. And I was suggesting connecting the dots with how this is what was Chaldea, but some people or scholars suggest that it's just a term that means basically in all of those places that were just mentioned. So some people suggest that it's not a place at all, but it's just a term that's referring to these were the 3 places that he founded. But then it goes on in verse 11, and it says, from that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, and Calah, and Rezin. So these are all, as we talked about earlier, Assyrian cities, and Calah being a really, as it mentioned, great city, or when it says great, basically big and strong city that was back at that time. And it was even more popular than Nineveh, although Nineveh also became, especially later, very popular because it ended up becoming the capital eventually of Assyria. And there are some people that say, well, actually, the text is kind of ambiguous because it's not talking about Nimrod going to Assyria after all of the Babel related stuff. In some notes I've found, it suggests that Ashur was the founder of Assyria. And I already had mentioned that the term Ashur actually means Assyria. So the land of Ashur is literally Ashur's land, the guy who founded it. But this is only some people's speculation, and some people believe that Nimrod could have been Ashur, which is how this place could have get founded. We have so many speculations as we go into this, like who was Nimrod? Because as we talked about, that wasn't probably his name. His name, some people suggest, as I was just talking about, could have been Ashur. So his name might have been the name that became the Assyrian kingdom. There also was a lot of other things that I found, like some people say that it's King Armaphel, which, as I was mentioning, is actually a king we'll find in some of the following chapters as we get into especially chapter 14. Because if you look at verse 1, we'll just read that it says, "At that time, Amraphel, king of Shinar," which, if we now come back to what we're talking about here, essentially it's saying that the kingdom and the land of Shinar is Nimrod's. If we look at the end of 10, it says that Babel, Erech, Akkad, Kalna, that all of those cities were in the area of Shinar, which is Babylon or Sumer or Samaria. And also some people refer to it as Mesopotamia. And then it's at least my conjecture that it says, he went to Assyria after that, built Nineveh, Rehoboth, which was possibly a suburb, because in the Net Bible, again, it refers to the name meaning broad streets of a city. So that's why it's suggested to essentially be an outlier, but yet still predominant city back in the Assyrian kingdom. And then we have Kala, which was 20 miles north of Nineveh. And it seems that Rezim was also one of these cities, and it was in between as well. So let's talk about Kala for a second, or in some places I found that it was Kalak. And then in another place, I saw that someone even asserted that it was Kalhu, but also some people suggest that the city's name was actually Nimrod. So is it possible that this is the city that he founds after himself? Man, some of this stuff can be really difficult. I'm not a historian or geologist, so doing this kind of homework is really tedious. So I will leave it to you guys to take it from here, and I'm always willing and open to talk and present more stuff if I get any information to look at and present to you guys. So with that said, we got Kala, which was possibly the capital for some time, because if it was the great city, then most likely that was their way of saying the biggest city or the capital. With that, we actually, believe it or not, come to the end of Nimrod's story. And also, believe it or not, even though the story kind of lives on in other ways, it doesn't ever refer to him as that name again. So it seems as if they're painting this picture of this larger than life guy named Nimrod. And man, he was quite a figure, to say the least. And he founded all of these kingdoms, which ended up becoming places that were really infamous through history, to say the least. Samaria, Assyria, Babylon, these were always present enemies to the Israelites. And as we mentioned, I was trying to make that connection of Ham essentially being someone who is cursed. And we find that there have always been a lot of pagan and dark rituals and practices that have come from these people, although it's obviously spread all over. A lot of the deepest, darkest of, you could say, the spiritual or magical art seems to come from these people. The most ancient spiritual narratives are from the Sumerian and the Babylonian and the Assyrian people. The Chaldeans were very infamous even when you get into the New Testament and into Daniel, one of the prophets, not too long before the period of the New Testament. So, yeah, with that said, I'll throw out just a couple more things that people have suggested. So, some Greek sources suggest that Nimrod could have been King Ninus or even Zoroaster. So, I don't need to mention those deep, dark spiritual connections and a lot of New Age related stuff. Another interesting thing that I read was the Armenian people referred to potentially Nimrod as Bel, which is related to Baal, which means Lord or Master. And that can be both a good or a bad thing. And here is referred to as a bad thing because essentially one of the founding fathers, according to Armenian history, had to fight off Bel to create freedom for their people. And like I was saying, there were some kind of wars that were going back on in these days, and we'll get into it in chapter 14. But we also have a couple other interesting things that I found. Some people suggest that he was Hercules because, it talks about him being a great warrior. So could that be where the man, the myth, the legend of Hercules came from? Essentially that, his parents were essentially gods, and here he is, this human who's like a god because he's so strong and mighty that he appears to be this legend, because he was definitely a legend. And speaking of legends, the last one that I'll mention, which leads into the next son who we'll be talking about, we have some sources that say that Nimrod was potentially Osiris in Egypt. And speaking of Egypt or Mitzrayim, we have the son or the people of Mitzrayim. So with that, we get down into verse 13. He was the father of the Ludites. And so we'll go quick through these. So as far as I've seen, basically they're the people of Northwest Africa. the people of Lud or the Lydians, and they're mentioned in Jeremiah 46:9. Then we also have some other Egyptian tribes, Anamim, which was probably a northwestern Egyptian tribe. Then we have Lehabim, which was another Egyptian tribe, as mentioned. And then there's the Pathrazim, which was probably a southern Egyptian tribe. And then we have an interesting one, the Kazluchim, which it actually tells us in the text itself. And some people believe that it was later authors making a note incision just so people knew where these people came from, because later on it might have not been quite as obvious. But it says here that they were where the Philistine people came from. And so most people suggest that the Philistine, or as they're called here, the Casluhite people, lived in the Crete and also the Delta area of Egypt and spanning all the way up to Canaan. So that's very interesting because that's essentially where they end up getting found later on in scripture, and some people call them sea people at different points, which makes sense since they partially were settled in the island of Crete, but then they were also settled all along that coast. They were a pain in both Egypt's side and all throughout Canaan. And this is a group that you want to remember. And then we have the forgettable Caphratites, which couldn't find much on them, but they also apparently resided in the Crete area, and they were referred to as in the region beyond the Mediterranean. So that's kind of interesting, and that could also be alluding to these sea peoples. And some people suggest that maybe this is where the North American people ended up coming from. So with that, we have the Mitzrayim people. And then we finally settle on the last son of Ham, his son Canaan. And this is the guy who is cursed. And it's clear that he's probably not going to be the only one who's cursed, because look at some of these descendants. So we got Sidon, Heth. Let's start out with this first one. Sidon is essentially what ends up becoming the country of Sidon, which is referred to quite a bit, and also it is closely linked to Tyre, and it has a lot of connections also to the Hittite kingdom, which they became one of those big threats and larger people groups to the Israelites. And there's even some rivalry stuff and undesire to intermarry with them, as we'll read on in some of the future chapters. There's a story coming where one of the patriarchs and his wife, they tell their son not to marry or get connected with any Hittites, that would totally wreck them if he went off and did something like that. So you can obviously see that there was some tension between these groups the sons of Shem, where the Hebrews come from, and the sons of Ham, or Canaan specifically, they end up being in a lot of conflict. And just look at some of the names. So we have Heth, which a lot of people believe that this was the origin of the Hittite people. And one thing that I found out recently that was interesting is for quite a bit of history, a lot of skeptics laughed at biblical people who tried taking the people groups and especially the Hittites from scripture seriously and literally. And I mean, if you're reading about this group called the Hittites, why not believe that they were actually a real people that it was referring to? And so a lot of scholars have laughed at a lot of things related to the Bible. And for much of history, the scholars actually did not believe that the Hittites were even a people, that it was made up in the Bible. But it goes to show now that we have quite a bit of really good research on the Hittite people, and just the fact that we don't always have all the evidence for supporting everything in the Bible with current research. It doesn't mean that the research isn't coming, that there aren't people working on it, and that stuff that seems like dead ends really is just us digging around a door, waiting to find a mausoleum of gold related to scripture, because now there's actually a lot of developments with learning about their culture and their language and a lot of interesting things. And so I recommend some articles by a group called the Armstrong Institute, and they have a lot of good research from their organization, especially specifically on the topic of the Hittites. And so I found that interesting. We also have some other groups which it lists off, and this goes to show what I've been talking about. We have all of these ites. So the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites. You probably have heard of basically all these groups. So let's talk about and break these ones down, because these are in the lower Canaan area. So Sidon is obviously that northern, up in Lebanon, Syria. Some people also referred to this area, especially later in history, as the Phoenicians. And so we got that, but then we are also talking about the Hittites, which were a pretty big civilization that spanned from the Syria area, went up north, were in some of the Turkey and early Anatolia sort of regions, spanning from like that Turkey to Greece sort of area. They had quite a shifting kingdom through time, and it shrunk and grew bigger at different points, and it went further into Europe at moments, and then it came down further into Canaan at times, and then got pushed back and forth through time, and obviously they are no more. But again, a cursed people, you could say, because how many of these groups are still around? So we have the Jebusites. These are the first ones in, I guess you could say, the promised landish sort of area. But even Sidon ended up being promised land area. That was what was in the height of the Israel kingdom, some of the uppermost parts of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and then they even had some of that area and had taken over what the Hittites had. And then they had the threat to the north, which was then at that point what is considered as Aram through most of history, which is the Syrian people, which we'll talk more about. But then you jump down to the Jebusites, which are mentioned in several places. But in Joshua 18:28, we could start. It says how the city Heleph was actually a Jebusite city. But guess what city Heleph was? Heleph was actually Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was actually a Jebusite city. So here we have this group that is occupying what is actually Israel's center, like the center of Judah. This is pretty big. We have these Canaanite people who are settling in the land before the Hebrews are even getting formulated. So that's the Jebusites. They're the people that formed and were controlling essentially the core of Judea. And so they were going to be a threat to the Hebrews and them getting to the promised land. Then we have the Amorites, and the Amorites were just a little bit above that, kind of between the Judean and Israel borders. And so these are all kingdoms that were to the west, or basically sandwiched between the Mediterranean Sea, or some people called it the Great Sea back then, and the Dead Sea and the Jordan. So then there's another step up north, the Girgashites, and for them, this is pressing up towards the middle region of Israel when they had the Judea and Israel split. And that's something that'll take a while to get to. So, in short, Israel was actually two nations after they had three kings. They split into the southern kingdom, which was Judea, and the northern kingdom, which was Israel. And then later on, Israel fell and they got absorbed and they became Samaria, and Judah became equivocal with Judah, the Jews, Israel, and yet there's this mix of, technically there's still Israelites scattered all throughout in different tribes, but they're lost, but they're not. Anyways, that's way ahead. But we have the Hivites, which are just below and sandwiched between that Sidon area. And they are pressing up near Sidon and the Hittites up there. One other note with the Hivites, don't get them confused with the Hittites, is that they were basically a tent or village sort of tribe. And so that's one thing that I found in doing some research. Then I'll kind of fly through these next ones. So the Archites were essentially a city of Arca located in North Sidon, which is Lebanon. The Sinaites, which you shouldn't confuse with Sinai, because I was originally thinking that when I saw it. But essentially, they were in the place of Sin. Technically, it's spelled like Sin, S-I-N. But another town in Lebanon. And then got the Arvadites, which the only thing I could find on them was it was based off a city called Arvad, and it was located on an island near the coast. So then we got the Zemarites, which is a town of Sumur north of Arca. For anyone who knows what that means, good for you. Then the Hamathites lived in Hamath on the Orontes River. I had to look it up because I'm not familiar with the region, but I found out it's in Syria, and it also apparently has been a divisive place at some point. Then it goes on to say, as I was mentioning earlier, that after all of these descendants, that basically they were dispersed all over. So that's how they end up settling in all these different places around the promised land. So we've talked about Sidon being the upper borders of Canaan before you get into Aram, which is Syria. But we go down to Gerar, and essentially this was a rolling hill country, also kind of a desert sort of area as well. And it was a Philistine city, actually. So we have those people. Basically, they're along that coast, as we were mentioning. And, they were occupying that area in between Egypt and Canaan, but also along the coast. So even some of these cities that had control in the Judea and the Israel area, the Philistines kind of controlled the coast, it seemed, for at least part of history, and they caused trouble for all sorts of groups of people. There's also another name which everyone today even still knows, which it actually mentions Gaza. So it mentions that is the southernmost tip, the Gerar, Gaza, down by this area and region is where the Canaan territory ends. And he's an important son because remember, he's Ham's son who was cursed. And we can obviously tell just by looking ahead in the story of the Bible that they're going to present some challenges to the Hebrew people. With that said, we get close to the end of Ham's genealogy, and it has some name drops. It has the infamous cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and then there were some surrounding areas like Admah, Zeboim, and then it says as far as Lasha, which not entirely sure where that city was, but these were all in that east of Jordan in the Black Sea region. As you can guess, we'll definitely have our stories when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. There's actually a few stories that take place there, but it's an infamous ancient city, and it's gone now for good and obvious reasons that you'll find out. But that draws us to the end of Ham's line. So lastly, we're going to jump into Shem's family tree. And sons were also born to Shem, the older brother of Japheth, the father of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah was the father of Eber. 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg because of his days on the earth being divided, and his brother's name was Yoktan. Yoktan was the father of Almadad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadaram, Uzal, Diklah, Obal, Abimael, Shabah, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobad. All of these were sons of Yoktan. Their dwelling place was from Mesha all the way to Saphar in the eastern hills. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, and according to their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their nations, and from these the nations spread over the earth after the flood. Okay, so let's start out with the last son. We have Shem, and these are the 3 sons or branches of the family of the world that we have. All of them stemmed from Noah, and it goes over that at the very end in the last verse, in verse 32. But if we jump back to 21 and we go through this last section, we find out for sure that Shem is the oldest, and it seems as if maybe Ham is the middle child, because in the other accounts we have, it usually say Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So it seems as if Japheth is the youngest. And so my question is, if genealogies are important, if, the oldest son should be first, but he's actually last in the list, why is that? Is it because saving the best for last? Is that how genealogies went? Because obviously the oldest sons usually got their names in the headlight. They got to have the family or the nation named after them. They also got the inheritance almost all the time. So why is Shem being stuck at the end of the genealogy? And I have a guess into why. You notice how Japheth, it didn't really have any specific stories about any of the people in there. I think it's because it's trying to, even though it's not the best reason, get the family that has the least relevance to the biblical story over with first. Then Ham get into a little more detail and start showing some of the significant interactions of the groups that they would interact with later. But then we have Shem, which is where the whole rest of the story is going to go from here. And of course, it overlaps with both. We have a lot going on from Ham's line that is going to be interactions, but the core family that is going to become the core nation is stemming from Shem's line. And so we see right off the bat, it jumps into how he was the father of the sons of Eber. And that's kind of weird because then it backs up and it's like Shem, his sons were Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. So we've already covered a few of those. And I know that we'd already talked about Ashur. Ashur essentially is the founder of Assyria, and he was the son who founded it, or one of the sons of Shem founded pretty early on the nation of Ashur, which is Assyria. But then we have another one we've talked about a little bit, which is Aram. And Aram is Syria, and it's basically the uppermost Mesopotamia area. And it's also where we will find out that someone important lives for a time. And it's even where some family continues to reside. And it does play a pretty important role throughout the entire Old Testament. And an interesting thing is, if you look at that word Aram, you probably can see that if you add a few letters afterwards, it makes the word Aramaic, which is actually the nation in which the language Aramaic came from. And that's actually the language that survived and obviously went through some changes, but was actually the one that Jesus and his disciples used. And it was that Samaria and even into Judea, all of that region in the area, which it had become Rome by that point, they still had been using the Aramaic language at that point. So this is an important country here. Obviously, Assyria is critically vital. They pose as a constant threat to the entire world. They're one of the most brutal nations that has ever lived. They had some really militant and sick stuff, a lot of violence in their nation. And they also, as we were talking about earlier with Ham, it was the city that housed the capital of Nineveh, which a prophet named Jonah down the line ends up having to go visit. And he's not too excited about going there because he's probably scared he was going to get killed. Or at the very least, even if they did end up repenting, he hated them so much, it seems that he didn't even want to see them come to God and get to know the one true God. And so that's two of the nations. But then we come to this son called Elam, who is the founder of the country of Elam. And it was actually one of the big world powers towards the beginning of human civilization. And they controlled the southern coast of the Persian Gulf. So that area in modern day Iran. So if you start at the southern point of Babylon and then you take that and just go down the Persian Gulf and along that area is where Elam resided. And like I mentioned, it was one of the bigger powers back in the day. And then we have another son named Arphaxad. Don't have too much information on him, but it's said that it was probably a foreign name, and also it was probably a region of southern Assyria. And so it was kind of sandwiched in or below that area. If you take a look at the map during that time, we start getting a picture of what the known world was back then. We go down to Egypt and we take that as far down, and then even some of those other tribes that we had. And then we come up and go all through that Canaan area, and even the Hittites. We get even as far possibly as into Eastern Europe. And then we head pretty far southeast and we have the territory of Elam. And then we also have Lud in there, and this is the other son of Shem. And man, didn't we have a Lud earlier? So is it the same guy? Are the genealogies crossed over? And like I was saying, is there overlap? Because I'm sure that the mirroring pool wasn't very large. So could Lud have come from both a Ham and a Shem line because of one parent on one side and one on the other, and they got mixed up at some point? It's possible, but it's also possible, just like we had a guy named Canaan earlier on in the genealogy from Cain's side. So we have all sorts of things, and then we continue on and we see Havilah again. We're like, oh man, so wait, is this the Havilah that is the one that ended up settling in that Arabia area? And we find out he also settled in the Arabia area. So which one is it? Are they the same guy and they mixed up the genealogy, or were they confused so they put him in both? Because obviously Moses and the scribes and all them who are writing these things down, they're having to both listen to God and trust him to get the right information, and they're also trusting sources and the stories that have been passed on to them. So they're working with what they got a few thousand years after all of these things are taking place. So I'm sure it was a really difficult task, but you can see how much care and elaboration was gone into with making sure that they hit on all the important areas. And is it possible that they missed some of the major peoples? Well, obviously there's no India or Hindi sort of people group. There's no East Asians and there's no Chinese that are stemming from this. But there's also a story that does lead to that, and we might get into how that plays into Babel and what ends up happening with this huge nation that had something crazy happen to it and ended up dispersing. So we even saw at the end of Ham's genealogy that people were starting to disperse and spread out during these times, and it especially happened at one point during the account in the beginning of chapter 11. So again, we got Lud, and don't know if that connects to the Ludim, but again, not sure whether this is the same as the Ludim, which was the tribe that was in Africa settled as the Libyans, or whether this is a separate tribe and was part of the Assyrian people settled in that region. So then we start moving on in verse 23 into Aram and who his sons are. So, who descended from Aram, and what areas do we have within Aram? So, again, Aram is the Syria sort of area, and it's where cities like Damascus sit. So, we have Uz or Uts, which is actually a city back in ancient times that was in that Aram area, and one of the most popular stories in the Bible that's kind of off on its own is actually about a guy who lived in the land of Uz. And so that man's name was Job. And Job had his home city in Uz. And so then we get some other people. We got Hul, and don't really have much of any information on him. Same with Gether. And then we have Mosh, or if you want to call him Mash. He is actually the only one not noted in the First Chronicles genealogy, because I was mentioning this before, that there's actually a parallel genealogy that is running at the beginning of First Chronicles in chapter 1. So it basically has all of these groups and these people, all of the sons of humanity, you could say, but it's missing this guy. So were later editors unsure of this person, or they didn't have manuscripts that included this name, so they accidentally missed it. People are kind of unsure about this one, and no one seems to know much about where the place could have been, but obviously it could have been just a really early on tribe that ended up fizzling because, yeah, maybe the small group or family never really took off and they got assimilated and conquered, or even died out possibly. Then we go to Arphaxad's descendants, and it says that he had Shelah, and Shelah had Eber, and Eber is an important name, and we kind of were hinting at that earlier, that it starts Shem's genealogy out with this guy. Like, Eber was the main son or person to focus on, and he had two sons. So, what's going on here with this? So, the very first of the sons of Arphaxad, Shelah, again, not too much is known about this guy, and it doesn't mention anything specific other in scripture that points to this individual or these people. But sometimes certain names are kind of forgotten, except they're just in there as a stepping stone to someone else. And the name Eber, why is that important? Just take off the H and add a few letters afterwards, and you'll start to hear it. Hebrews. So Eber is the father of the Hebrews. And it gets into in the next verse that he had two sons, Peleg and Joktan. And so I kind of pronounced it in between a J and a Y there, because earlier I realized when I was reading, I said Joktan without even thinking about it. But most people would probably look at it and just pronounce it Joktan or something along those lines. And I wanted to explain here again in Hebrew, they don't have J's or a J sound. So everything with a J is actually a Y in Hebrew. So it's Yoktan. And so with this guy, it's going to follow his line. But then I'll give you guys a heads up that kind of like Cain's genealogy. Remember how the genealogy went through Cain's family line and then it abruptly ended? But then after a couple verses of talking about some other stuff, it jumps back into the genealogy and goes through Seth's line. So just think of it kind of like that. We're going to go through Yoktan's line, and then we're going to, after we talk a little bit about a story that leads into chapter 11 and halfway through there, then we jump back into the genealogy again in chapter 11 and we go through Peleg's family line. So there's a little bit of heads up, and hopefully you guys are reading along and sometimes reading ahead just to see what's going on in scripture. And so it's good to see some of the things that are happening and that are going on. And at times it's good to just stick to exactly where you're reading and not get too far ahead of yourself, because you can end up jumping to a lot of conclusions, or you can think that you understand something, then you can miss some of the fine details that will help you out later. So here we have some fine details about Yoktan's line, and it doesn't go into Peleg's. And it said that they were divided, which is kind of a big deal, right? You know, two brothers who are divided. Obviously, they're not physically probably in the same place, but it also means that they probably were not in a metaphorical way on the same page either. And they were divided, it seems, in this way. If nothing else, they were just divided into different groups or family clans, even despite being brothers and part of the same family. So it could simply just mean that they peacefully went their own ways. However, let's get into it. Who are Yoktan's children? So it starts off in the next verse in 26. It lists a whole bunch of children that he has. And to be honest, basically all of them are Southern Arabia and Yemen. So honestly, I'm going to do a speed round with this, and we'll just go through those children. So we have Almodad, and he was in South Arabia. We have Shelef. He founded a Yemenite tribe. We have Hazar Maveth, and he was also in southern Arabia. We have Dra, which I have a note here that it means moon. Obviously, there were tribes leading up to Islam where the moon is an important symbol. Then we got Hadaram, which don't have really much of any info on him. Probably same area, probably Yemen. And then we have Uzal, which is actually the old name of the capital in Yemen. So that's a cool and helpful piece of information. And then we got Dikla, which means date or palm. And then we have, hey, Havilah again. So we're getting back into that South Arabia region. And we continue on since we've talked about Havilah quite a bit. This could have been the same son, or it could have been a different one, but it seems they both settled in the same area. So imagine I started up a new podcast with another guy named Mike, and we had the Mike and Mike show. And then we just decided to name the show Mike after a while. It could be the same thing where two guys named Havilah ended up merging and consolidating into just one place called Havilah. It's possible that these two tribes could have mingled together, or it's possible that same guy, just with merging stems of family branches. They could have been confusing. So then we get down to Abimael, and interestingly, there's a South Arabian ancient people called the Sabaeans, and they probably have roots in one of Ham's descendants, the son Seba that we had talked about. And so with that, I have a note here that Abimael is actually a genuine Sabaean form, which means my father is God. And so then we move on to Sheba, and again, we kind of have some of this bleeding and overlapping. Sheba was also in southern Arabia, and so we have all of these conjoined tribes, and we have Ophir, and so also in the southern area of Arabia, and apparently it was connected to a lot of gold there, so they had a lot of good resources. And then we get to Jobab, and I can't find anything on this gentleman either, or his people. So we're just going to leave it at that. And then it talks about how all of those people were the sons of Joktan. And then it mentions how Joktan's living territory area range was from Mesha all the way to Safar in the eastern hills. So you got up in the Mesha area, which from what I was looking up was probably the Moabite area and possibly was one of the first kings who was ruling in that area. So that could have been how those people originated. And it's possible that Mesha, Mash, they could be equivocal. So just for information, the area of the Moabites was a little up above the Arabian Peninsula, just a little bit northwest of there. And then you go down to the lower part of Yemen and the bottom peninsula of Arabia. And so this is where Yoktan's people were from. And you also had a group that ends up being a people called the Edomites, which we'll talk about them, but they end up getting sandwiched in that area of the Yoktan people, and they probably end up mingling with them and all. And we can talk more about that later because that comes quite a bit down the line in Genesis. So here we have it. That is the end of the names in the genealogy, and then it emphasizes how all of these things are not just according to the sons, but they're the sons of Shem, and they have been of Ham and Japheth too, but it's according to their families and according to their languages and according to their nations. So we had a list of, as we mentioned, not only sons, but families and groups that broke off into different ethnicities and carried on different languages, even though they might have not had much of an identity as a nation. But then we have, as it mentions, nations and places that started huddling in a lot of people, building civilizations and cities in centers where the people could gather and become a more proficient tribe. And so this was especially what was important and what it was all about to them back then, because in order to provide safety for themselves, they had to have a group. And you see this in inner cities too. People end up joining gangs to have a people to call their family, if you can call it that, and to have a people to protect you in a dangerous place. The world, especially with people seemingly like Nimrod running around back in those times, was a very, we could say, barbaric and probably still violent place, even though God took it out, because everyone was only thinking and doing evil all the time. It seems like it's probably starting back up a little bit again. Just a little bit of drinking here from Noah. He's doing really good. He's the best man on earth, and here he falls, and then he ends up cursing an entire part of his family line. Things are off to a rough start, and now we have this genealogy, and people are breaking off and spreading, which has its positives and negatives. Of course, God said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, so they can't fill it if everyone's sticking in one area, which we'll talk about that issue, which occurs in the next episode. But one more thing that I have to share. There's so many other aspects that we could go into, but it does rein it back into how this is the genealogy actually of Noah's children. And so that emphasis that comes back to how Noah is basically the one repopulating the earth. And there's so many more myths and connected stories from other cultures that relate to the story of Noah, but we're trying to understand what specifically the Bible is talking about. But we had to have a lot of history today to be able to understand what the groups and the people, and even like it says, the people that broke off and spoke languages, what their origin was and who they were, so that we can get a better picture. And as we jump into this next story, I believe that it's one of the dividing lines of history between very ancient history and what starts to become just older, or I guess still somewhat ancient history, when we get into the story of Babel. And I have a surprise guest on next week, which I'm really looking forward to. So thanks if you bore with me through the entire episode and be reflecting on genealogies and where it leads us.